By the time we get to the 26th chapter, the book of Genesis, he has grown up with a father that's accustomed to not telling the truth. We find in the 26th chapter that old Isaac is lying about his wife because he doesn't want to get in trouble. In the 27th chapter, Jacob shows his own true colors. He deceives his brother Esau and gets his birthright. And he was a twin brother, but his brother Esau was born a few moments before him, and so he received the lion's share of the inheritance, which in this time would have been 90% of his father's wealth, the firstborn got. All the other sons split up the rest. So it was kind of like getting nothing. Well, he takes the birthright from his brother by deception. A little bit later in the chapter 27, he gets his father to bestow not only the material blessing he'd already stolen from his brother, but he gets his blind, aged father to give him the spiritual blessing, which was far more important than just getting all the cows and sheep, because they would grow old and die. The important thing was having God's blessing to translate that little bit of material blessing into great wealth. And so and you know the story, he comes in and he puts the hide of animals on his arms so that he would appear to be rough, and he wears an old outfit, a hunting outfit, so he would smell like the fields. And he comes into his poor, aged, blind father getting near death, and his father can't see him, and he says, "It's Jacob's voice, let me check this out." And he gets close and he says, "It smells like Esau." I don't know what that says about Esau. And then he feels of his arms and he says, "It feels like Esau." And I don't know what that means about Esau either, but in other words, he deceives and tricks his dad. Well, in chapter 28, things heat up at home, and Esau is no pansy. In fact, if you really look in the scriptures, in the description of Esau, I think he's someone that all of us would have enjoyed knowing. He was suntanned, muscular, athletic, outdoorsy, a hunter, a man of skill, and just sounds like a California boy. And Jacob was a fellow that hung around the tents, was pale, liked to cook, probably liked to sew too, and kind of a wimp. And here's these two fellas, and the little tent boy, the wimpy one, is sitting in the tent figuring out how to cheat his brother out of everything. Now, if this was a movie, you would be rooting for the Esau. But seeing from God's perspective, we see what God's doing, and things heat up. In the 28th chapter, we find Jacob having to leave home because his brother's going to kill him if he doesn't. And this is just to prepare you for this meeting that takes place, for you to see what happens. On the way, he walks 600 miles northeast. It would be like walking up to Oregon, or just before the Oregon, up to Mount Shasta, or maybe up to Oregon. And he walks that far, and on the way, one night he sleeps with a rock as his pillow, and in that night he dreams, and actually it's not a dream, it's a vision, and he sees a ladder going up to heaven, and God speaks to him and makes a covenant with him. Well, in chapter 29, he meets his wife Rachel, and he finally gets deceived himself. He wants to marry her, but on the wedding night, during the big party, his father-in-law slips in her older sister, whose name is Leah, which literally means weak and runny-eyed. It doesn't sound too pleasant, but he gets weak and runny eyes instead of his first choice, and then he has to serve for 20 years altogether to get 2 wives and all of these flocks. Chapter 30, this deceiver who is planning everything himself, and by the way, he plans how to get his dad's inheritance, he plans how to get the spiritual blessing, he plans how to get his own wife, and then he tricks his father-in-law out of everything he can with the flocks. And by chapter 30, we find him being very prosperous. Well, another pattern takes place. Chapter 31 of Genesis, he is fleeing from his father-in-law. His father-in-law, it's interesting, in chapter 31 it says, Jacob notices his face is not toward him as it used to be. That's a polite way of saying his father-in-law was ticked off and was ready to get him. So in chapter 32, he has nowhere to turn but back toward home. And when we get to the 32nd chapter, we get to a very important chapter in the Scripture because it so mirrors where we are. And tonight you think about your life, and I think about my life, and go through everything and think about all these elements: deception, trickery, dishonesty, craftiness, planning, leaving God out, right down the line, trying to amass everything that is possible to be amassed, and all of a sudden, every door shuts, and Jacob has nowhere to turn but to face home and Esau, and he's scared to death. And the only thing that he can remember is, and we don't have time to go into this, but he remembers and he says, God, about 20 years ago I met you on the way up here, and you promised me you'd take care of me. But it's interesting, the Lord doesn't really affirm anything because he wants to bring Jacob to the end of himself. And when we get to the 32nd chapter and beginning in the 22nd verse of chapter 32, and that's where we'll begin tonight, we find a man that has nowhere to turn. And we find a man that God is going to take to a special school. And it's called the school of power with God and man. And the only way that he can get Jacob's attention is to scare him. And that's so true sometimes in our lives, isn't it? When do people really turn to the Lord? In the foxholes? In the hospitals? When they've lost their wife? When they've lost their business? When their children are critically sick? That's a time that it seems like people really make these decisions. And it's true with Jacob. Let's begin in the 22nd verse. And he rose up at night, Genesis 32:22, and took his 2 wives and his 2 women servants and his 11 sons and passed over the ford Jabbok. He takes his family and he takes them across the river to a place of safety, and he is left. Look at verse 23. And he took them and he sent them over the brook, and he sent over all that he had. And Jacob, verse 24, was left alone. Number one, and the first thing to think about tonight, and don't worry about writing this down because it's written down, just think. The first thing that God had to do in Jacob's life is get him to the place of God's choosing. Now, Jacob had been choosing his own way all along. He had chosen his own tent to get his brother's inheritance. He'd chosen to this little disguise to get his father's blessing. He had chosen to go up to this area where his family had come from, up in Padan Aram, and to get his wives. But now he hadn't chosen to come here. He'd come to the place of God's choosing. And this isn't new at all, and if we had time tonight, I'd love to take you through, and I'll just mention the scriptures. I think about Joseph, who we're going to look at next week. The place God chose for Joseph was the prison, right? Do you remember that? The prison where he was put into manacles, and God got his attention in prison. And I think of the place that God chose for Moses. Moses couldn't seem to hear the Lord's voice when he was in the palace, but God took him to the backside of the desert. And he took him out there with a bunch of sheep and all alone for 40 years. And he got his attention. And I think about David. God had to take David out into the wilderness, running for his life from Saul. And in that time, and we have the whole book of Psalms to testify of it, God got his attention. For Daniel, it was as a prisoner, taken off as a prisoner of war. For Jonah, it was the stomach of a whale or a great fish. For Paul, it was thrown from his horse in the dust on the way to Damascus. But God has the way of bringing us to the place of his choosing. And for you tonight, it might be that you're at the end of your rope at work. It might be you're at the end of your rope with your physical condition. It might be you're at the end of your rope with your family, your marriage, emotions. Or it might just be just an internal longing for something that you just can't put your finger on. You just say, I'm not in the place I want to be spiritually. Once we get to that place where we can totally focus on the Lord, and when we can just say, nothing else matters to me, nothing but you. and I want to lay hold on your presence and your power. Then we've, number one, come to the place of God's choosing. But God had to do something else to him. And if you notice again in verse 23, look what it says in verse 23. Not only had God led him specifically and directly and just channeled him right to the place he was choosing, and by the way, the Lord is in control, and nothing happens in our life that fools him or takes him off guard. He knows the path that we take. But look at verse 23. And he took them and sent them over the brook. And the end of the verse says, he sent over all that he had. He came, he herded them across this brook, and then he goes back across the brook and stands on the other side, and he looks across that river, and he sees every single thing he has in the world, and he has separated himself from it. It's interesting. The Lord didn't have to tell us that. But I think that teaches us another principle tonight as we pursue communion with God. We need to cross over from everything, all possessions, all goals and personal desires, cross over from all of them and get alone with the Lord. There's such a distraction. God had to get Moses out of the palace. He had to get David out of the court of Saul. He had to get Jonah out of being this freelance prophet in the court of Jeroboam II and get him into a fish. But whatever it takes, he had to just put everything behind. And Jacob stands 38 centuries ago in the darkness, under the stars, on the other side of the river, everything dear to him over there, and he stands there alone. And what's interesting is, look at verse 24. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. For just a moment, turn over to the book of Hosea. If you don't know where it is, don't turn, you'll get lost, but it goes Daniel, Hosea. Or if you start at Malachi, go back 12. But right after Daniel, 13 books south of Matthew, Hosea chapter 12. And we find, interestingly enough, several hundred years later, the prophet Hosea comments on this night. In fact, Hosea comments on it 12 centuries after it happened, under the inspiration of God. And this is what he says, Hosea chapter 12, verse 3. Verse 2 talks about Jacob, and it says in verse 3, he took his brother by the heel in the womb. That's interesting. That's what the 25th chapter of Genesis says, that Jacob was holding on to his brother, trying to pull him back in. He wanted to be first born. Even in the womb, he was struggling for prevailing over his brother and being first. Kind of tells you his personality. He might have been a wimp in the tent, but he sure had a big dominant desire to be first. But he took his brother and was pulling him in the womb. And then look at verse 3, the second half. Because this is not a sermon title. This is actually the prophet and the inspiration of God's impression of what is happening in this night we're looking at. Because it says, and by his strength he had power with God. God loves to channel our personal strength, our personal ambitions and desires. He loves to get us into that place of his choosing, leaving everything behind, and then take that great desire and channel it his way. There's nothing wrong with being motivated. There's nothing wrong with being excited or enthused. It's just being enthused for what God is enthused for. And Hosea 12 says, yea, verse 4 of chapter 12, he had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept, he made supplication to him. He found him at Bethel, and there he spake with us, even the Lord of hosts. Well, that's Hosea's comment on this whole thing. And basically he says that that night, on that side of the brook, he found power with God as he wrestled with his angel. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep theology, but that angel, we believe, and it'll show up a little bit later in the dialogue he has with him, is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. It's the angel of the Lord. It's a Christophany or theophany. It's the Lord, the angel of the Lord, Christ, before he was incarnate. Well, verse 24 says, he wrestled with this man to the breaking of the day. And what we see is that he knew that this was his moment of something, and he wasn't going to give up. And this in this dark, shadowy night, and it's just so obscure what's happening, but this angelic creature comes and wrestles with him literally. And Jacob was just grappling. If you've ever seen, I don't know if you've ever wrestled, but if you can't win, you just hold on for dear life. And if you hold on tight enough, you might not get pinned unless they're good. And then you can maybe get a technicality or get some points for obscuring the judge or something. And that's what he's doing. He's just trying anything. Verse 25 says, and when he, that's the angel of the Lord, saw he didn't prevail against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. The angel was, now an angel, especially the angel of the Lord, could have wiped out the whole earth with one finger. I mean, there's no problem, but he is going along with this thing, with this wrestling match, and he's seeing that he's not getting his attention, and so he reaches down with that finger, and he just touches the hollow of his thigh. He just touches his leg here, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint instantly as he wrestled with him. And we see the next thing, not only did he come to God's place, and not only had he left everything behind, not only did he hold on for dear life and continued, but God cripples him in verse 25. He reaches down and he cripples him. He injures him. And you might be going through something tonight that you feel like is an injury. Losing a loved one, losing an opportunity. God has to do a lot to get our attention sometimes, but it's always for his glory, and it's wonderful. Because look at what happens in verse 26. And he said, let me go. Again, this is the angel of the Lord speaking. Let me go, for the day breaketh. And Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said unto him, what is your name? That's interesting, because in the Old Testament, your name was really a revelation of your character. Remember, Israel means prince with God, and all those things. They all had Adam, means that man, and the whole idea of man. Abel means worthless or a breath or something transient. Each name meant something. And what's interesting, Moses, by the way, means to draw out. And what was Moses? Drawn out of the water, out of the Nile River. Each name meant something. Well, in verse 27, when he said, what is your name? He said, now if you know Hebrew, you know what he said? Deceiver, supplanter, grasper after my own stuff. That's what Jacob means. Jacob means someone that grasps for their own thing. And verse 28 says, he says, your name will be called no more Jacob, but Israel. He said, your name is no longer going to be deceiving, supplanting, pulling everybody out of the way, grasper. He said, your name is going to be Israel. And what does Israel mean? He defines it for us. It's that next part of verse 28. As a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Well, what do we see taking place here? We see in verse 26 that Jacob clings to the presence of this divine messenger. He clings to his presence. He says, I won't let you go unless you do something in my life. There's something active about our coming to God. I like the way Isaiah put it in the 65th chapter. He said, is there anyone that will stir up themselves enough to lay hold on God? Prayer is much more than, now I lay me down to sleep. Thanks for the food, Lord. God bless you. Good night. It's something more than that. There's something of an earnest struggle. Do you remember a few weeks ago we talked about that? About the fact that prayer is an earnest struggle, full-hearted. We see that with Jacob. He clings to God's presence. And look at verse 9. Just go across, because it's not only clinging to the presence. The reason he's holding on to this angel, look at verse 9 of the same chapter. Because this is on the way. He's thinking and he's talking, and he says in verse 9, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, the Lord that said, return to your country and your kindred, and I will deal well with thee. You see, he's thinking through God's promises. He's not only clinging to God's presence, but he has laid hold in his mind on the past promises God made. And then look at verse 12 of the same chapter. He said, you said, I will surely do thee good and make thy seed as the sand of the sea. He's reminding God of his promises, and that's an element of our prayers. Does God forget? No. But God is glorified as we come to him in prayer, laying hold on him and claiming his promises to us. And that's what we're going to do in just a few moments. Well, the next thing that happens is verses 27 and 28 that I already read to you. But what we see there is God transforms him. You say, where did you see that? Well, it's in the names. God said, what's your name? He said, deceiver. God says, you're not going to be a deceiver anymore. You're going to be a prince that has power with God and man. I'm going to transform you, buddy. I'm going to change you. I'm going to make you a different person. And Jacob said, verse 29, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And this angel said, why dost thou ask after my name? And he blessed him there. See, this is some of the mystery that shrouds this. And if we didn't have Hosea's perspective, we would still be in the dark. But what had happened was God took the time to come down and to deal with this man personally, because it was after him that his people would be named. What do we call the Jews? Israel, the sons of Israel, the children of Israel. We see the transformation of Israel in this place. Not the conversion. I really believe in chapter 28, this guy makes the decisive, faith-filled act toward the Lord, because God reveals himself to him, and God says, now you will have my covenant, and I call you to myself. I think that he really neglected his calling until this point. And I remember talking with John last summer about this. I says, in light of your book on lordship, when did he get saved? Chapter 28 or chapter 32? He says, that is a good question. Because it really looks like he's saved in chapter 32, but God truly puts his covenant relationship with him in chapter 28. And that's a divine mystery. And many have gone through that. I remember different ones that have said, I really feel I came to know the Lord here, but he didn't change my life till here. I don't know what God is doing, except by the time we get to chapter 32, he's a different man. God turns him inside out. And so we see that he's changed by God. And look from chapter 32, verse 28 on. He is clothed with power. Verse 29 says he asks after his name. Verse 30 says, and Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. Why? For I have seen God, what? Face to face. 38 centuries ago, as the sun began to rise out of the east, on this little wilderness spot on the shore of the Jabbok River, we see an interesting sight. Verse 31, and as he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. As the sun rose over that brook that day, it was obvious to all who would ever look at Jacob that he was a marked man. He was crippled. He was crippled in his body to forever remind him, as long as he was on this earth, that he wasn't going to make it on his own power anymore. He halted upon his thigh. Therefore the children of Israel never ate of that part, the sinew which shrank which is the hollow of the thigh, unto this day, because he, God, touched the hollow of his thigh. What does that teach us? It's just a simple story. A simple story of a man that comes to the presence of God, that clings to his presence, clings to his promises. God gets a hold of him, transforms him, clothes him with power, and makes that evident to others. It's a simple story. It's a true historical event. How does it impact us tonight? Well, that's what our prayer time is going to be about. And if you do have your books, you can use those tonight, because we're just going to have these 6 simple things as we go to prayer, and we're going to have a good half hour of time to pray in just a moment. But I just want to have each of us ask ourselves these questions. Do we feel God drawing us to the place of his choosing? Are we willing to put out the din of this world? Are we willing to put out all the clanging of the California or San Luis Obispo or Maryland or whatever life, and come to a quiet place of God's choosing? And then are we willing, secondly, to continue laying hold of God until we prevail? We say, God, I want you to bring about your promises in my life almost as much as you want to bring them about in my life. God said He wants us to have the wisdom that is from above, James chapter 3 says. The wisdom that is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated. We should be full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. That's just something God wants to have in our life, one of many promises He's given us. Have we been crippled of self-sufficiency? What does God have to do to get our attention so we won't be self-sufficient? The Scriptures say in John 15, apart from Christ we can do what? Nothing. We can just put a little comma after that, do, because apart from Christ we can do a lot, don't we? We do it all the time, but it amounts to nothing when we don't do it in His strength. And that's what this whole meeting with God is about, that He would be crippled of His self-sufficiency, and then we see Him clinging to God's presence and promises. And I wonder, is that our habit of life? When you are driving, when you are working, when you are going to school, when you are just living life, and when we're just in our everyday lives, are we consciously clinging to the presence and promises of God? He that promised us, lo, I'm with you always. He that said that there is nothing I will withhold from you if you walk uprightly. I'll give it all to you. Cling to my presence, cling to my promises. Is that what we're doing? Are we allowing Him to change us into His image more each day? God had a specific image He wanted Jacob to have, and it wasn't being a self-sufficient deceiver. He wanted him to be a dependent, power-filled man of God. And that's the image. And I think about what 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, but we all, with faces made open, are changed into the image of the glory of the Lord more each day as we gaze on Him. And finally, are we aware of His power, and are we letting Him clothe us more each day with His power?